Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers University Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. The Center for Security, Race and Rights engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. You can learn more about CSRR's work at its website, csrr.rutgers.edu. Today's episode is entitled Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, featuring Dr. Audrey Truschke and Dr. Ivan Kalmar. Audrey Truschke is a professor of history and director of Asian studies at Rutgers University, Newark. Ivan Kalmar is a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. Both are contributors to the co-edited book by myself and Dr. John Esposito entitled Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism. In this episode, Dr. Truschke and Dr. Kalmar shed light on the rise of Islamophobic violence and anti-Muslim policies in South Asia, respectively. Indeed, global Islamophobia and right-wing populism have grown and intensified at an alarming rate across the world. In the most egregious cases, Islamophobia has cost Muslims their lives and liberty. In India, for example, Muslims are bearing the brunt of an alarming rise of Hindutva, a right-wing Hindu supremacist political movement endorsed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Thousands of Muslim Indians, as a result, have been killed by sectarianism fueled by Hindutva. In Europe, right-wing populists leveraged anti-Muslim racism after 9/11 to further polarize Western societies for their own political gain. Right-wing politicians' core principles that are opposed to the European Union and immigrants are deliberately framed in Islamophobic terms. Let's hear what our guests have to say about a topic eroding civil and human rights across the globe.
Thank you so much. That was a very kind and generous introduction. So it's really my pleasure to be with you all today. I am here to talk with you guys a little bit about Islamophobia and authoritarianism in India. And we're a little unfortunate in this regard because we always have new examples and new material of Islamophobia and authoritarianism in proportion to India's decline of religious freedom and democracy. The most recent example of this came probably about 2 weeks ago when the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom released a new interim report on India. They characterized the report, and you can see the title of their press briefing here, as documenting, quote, India's collapsing religious freedom conditions. The report documents a whole range of violations of human rights, specifically religious freedom, most of which target and or impact Muslims in the country most severely. Muslims are around 14% of the population of India. The report lists individual attacks on Indian Muslims numbering in the hundreds for 2024 alone, and we're not even done with this year yet. The report is both surprising and unsurprising. It's a little surprising because the USCIRF, as we call them for short, they usually issue reports in the spring. And so this is a rarer example of a sort of midterm report for them, which they say is justified by a sort of alarming decline of religious freedom in the nation. It's unsurprising, however, be that Indian Muslims are experiencing the brunt of these alarming conditions on the ground. And that's unsurprising since, as the report also notes, India's leading politicians, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, have significantly ratcheted up their anti-Muslim rhetoric in the past year. In 2024, let's say the last 10 months, Modi and other Indian leaders have repeatedly depicted Muslims as infiltrators and spread a series of blood libel claims against them. These include allegations that Muslim men are luring Hindu women into marriage and forced conversion and other sorts of things in that vein. Now, if you follow the news on India, you may have heard of some of the specific incidents that are cited in this report, the USCIRF report. But you're pretty unlikely to have heard about all the incidents cited here. And that's because of India's state control of the media. India currently ranks 158 out of 180 nations for press freedom. India ranks below most of its South Asian neighbors, including Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan. Additionally, Indian authorities do not target all journalists equally. Okay, they especially clamp down on journalists that fall into two categories. One is journalists who happen to be Muslim themselves, and the second are journalists who report on Islamophobia. The Indian state has many methods at its disposal for attacks on family members, violence, and fatal violence. So how do we get here? And what happens next? I can't fully answer those questions today, but in an attempt at getting at some kind of answer to them, I'm going to focus on three specific actions taken by the Indian state in recent years. These include Kashmir policy changes that were first unveiled in mid-2019. Second is the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, was enacted in late 2019. And the third are the Delhi riots in February of 2020. Now, please note the time frame. All of these events sort of first debuted within less than a year. Also, all of them have repercussions today. And what I want to do is go through each, briefly discuss each in turn. And these are also the three foci of this recent article of mine that I published in Dr. Aziz and Esposito's edited volume. But then I'm also going to try to give you some updates on sort of each one of these in 2024, kind of where we stand now, going beyond the original scope of my article. So for all three events, we have to go back to the summer of 2019. So in the summer of 2019, India's BJP, its largest Hindu nationalist party, had just won general elections in the nation by a historic margin. Now, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, promotes Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, which is a far-right political ideology of Hindu supremacy. Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is fascist in the classical sense, because its early leaders took inspiration from Nazi Germany, and they took both inspiration and models from Mussolini's Italy. I have a colleague who likes to say these folks are the original fascists. Now, Hindu nationalism was a minority view in India for decades, because fascism, but that changed over time. And Hindu nationalists took over India's central government via elections in 2014. Between 2014 and 2019, India plummeted by almost every metric we have. Human rights, religious freedom, civil rights, freedom of the press, democracy, all of these tanked. The main thing that went up were crimes against Muslims. And so going into the 2019 election, the BJP was running on that record, and they won by a landslide. Drunk with victory, one of the BJP's first moves in their second term was revoking Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, and thereby stripping Kashmir of its semi-autonomy. Now, for some of you, that makes perfect sense. But for those of you who are not fully up to date on your history of Kashmir, let me give you just a little background. Kashmir is a region that sits between India and Pakistan and China. It's been disputed since Indian and Pakistani independence in 1947. Practically, India runs the southern half, basically what's orange on the map here. Notably, India controlled or India occupied Kashmir, and many do see it as an occupation. This is India's only majority Muslim state. Now, since 1950, when the Indian Constitution went into effect, India occupied Kashmir was ensured certain freedoms, a certain kind of autonomy to run its own land area. And this was in deference to Kashmir being disputed territory and, legally speaking, not part of India proper. In 2019, summer of that year, the BJP stripped Kashmir of its autonomy. And that opened the door to direct rule by the BJP, to Indian settlement in the region, and ultimately to demographic change and a shift away from the region being a Muslim majority area. Unsurprisingly, stripping Kashmir of autonomy and opening the door to all of those things was pretty deeply unpopular among Kashmiris, who are about 95% Muslim in the area. So the Indian state accompanied this downgrade in Kashmir's political status with a series of measures that were designed to control information, including a 7-month full communications blackout. So during those 7 months, August 2019 to March 2020, there was no cell service, no internet in Kashmir. No independent journalists were allowed in. Politicians were detained. Schools and shops were largely closed. India lifted the blockade in March 2020, but the Indian government kept the internet deliberately slow for many further months. And they openly announced that they would be tracking all internet users in Kashmir moving forward. We still lack a lot of precise information today about the extent of human rights violations in Kashmir post-2019, but what we know is atrocious. As of today, India-controlled Kashmir is among the most unfree places in modern South Asia. Now, I do want to note that India just held elections in Kashmir a week or two ago. These elections were much delayed and they were not fair and free. I can't say much more than that about that, however, because it's so new. But I will say this. The new Indian-sanctioned Kashmiri government will hold pretty limited power. Presumably, they'll all recall at all points what happened to the last India-sanctioned Kashmiri government, namely that it was dissolved by New Delhi in 2018 when it became inconvenient, and then Kashmir's autonomy was revoked the following year. Moving on to my second topic. In mid-December of 2019, the BJP-led government of India unveiled and passed into law the Citizenship Amendment Act. We call it the CAA for short. The CAA provides a fast track to Indian citizenship for members of all religious groups except Muslims. At the same time, the BJP also announced that they would be conducting an India-wide National Register of Citizens. We call that the NRC for short. The NRC would force everyone living within Indian borders to prove their citizenship using certain documents, like birth certificates, or else be rendered stateless. Here's the critical part. Many Indians don't have those sorts of official documents, and so they will become non-citizens. Of the tens of millions, possibly more, projected to lose their citizenship in the NRC, everybody will be able to fast track themselves back to being Indian citizens through the CAA, except for Muslims. Muslims alone will be rendered stateless and thus vulnerable to things like detention centers. Now, when the CAA and NRC were announced, Indians protested en masse between December of 2019 and March of 2020. A lot of folks protested who aren't the normal suspects to take to the streets, as exemplified by this genre of signs that appeared at the protest. It's so bad that even fill in the blank are here. The parents, I'm here with my ex, the cynics, and so forth. Ultimately, these protests were ended by the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we all recall, just shut down everything in March of 2020. Then 4 years went by. And in March of 2024, the Indian government implemented the Citizenship Amendment Act. So before that, it had been passed into law, but the BJP had not issued sort of clarifying rules. And so it was in law, but not actually being used. In March of this year, it went into effect. The repercussions are not yet clear. And in large part, that's because the NRC has not been implemented India-wide. Okay, so we're missing its companion, the NRC, we're missing its companion part there. I will note that the NRC was implemented in Assam, a specific state in northeastern India, several years ago. And in that case, it resulted in close to 2 million Indian Muslims being stripped of their citizenship. Even without the NRC, the CAA is still pretty bad news. And human rights observers on the ground have called attention to how the CAA going into effect has encouraged an increase in on-the-ground targeting of Muslim communities in India. Now, in the midst of the anti-CAA protests going back to 2019 to 2020, all right, there was a pogrom. The pogrom occurred in February in Delhi, India's capital, which is in the northern part of the country. Then U.S. President Donald Trump was actually on the ground in Delhi when this occurred. And predictably, given his moral fiber, he said nothing, as Hindu mobs unleashed widespread violence against Muslim communities, especially in northeastern parts of the city of Delhi. Dozens were killed and more were injured in this event. In the riot's aftermath, the Delhi police arrested numerous people. But here's the kicker. They did not arrest the Hindu perpetrators of the pogrom. They arrested the Muslim community leaders in the area. the people who we might say represented the victims. Many of those arrested remain in jail today. Some of them with charges, some without charges, all without trial. They're generally held on sedition charges. The most well-known of those jailed in the aftermath of the 2020 Delhi pogrom is Umar Khalid, who remains in jail more than 1,400 days now. It's very dangerous to be a Muslim leader in India at present. And it's also dangerous just to talk about the riots. And there's been no accountability for the perpetrators of the 2020 Delhi pogrom. This is a pattern with Hindu nationalist violence in India. It's going after the victims and trying to shut down not anti-Muslim violence, but discussions thereof. And I'll give you one other example. In early 2023, the BBC, based in the United Kingdom, came out with a 2-part documentary on Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Among other things, the documentary covered Modi's culpability and involvement in the Gujarat riots of 2002, so more than 20 years ago. Those riots left a few thousand Indian Muslims dead. Modi's participation in the riots is quite well known and extremely well documented. There's really no scholarly debate or human rights-centered debate on that point. Still, this documentary was banned in India. The BJP-led government even raided the BBC's offices in Delhi in order to send the very clear message, don't criticize the BJP. Now, the intimidation of Western media is a notable escalation for India's Hindu nationalists, but it tracks very much with the growing strength and extremism of their movement at present. As of now, India has been following this dark path of authoritarianism, populism, fascism, and rampant Islamophobia for more than a decade. In my view, any realistic chance that we might have had several years back of recovering the old sort of secular India, that's long gone. Too much has changed for that. What we can do now, of course, is hope for a brighter future, a future in which India will change into something that serves its people, including its religious minorities, better. But the path to that future must include accountability. And that's in really short supply right now. Within India, there are few mechanisms left to hold politicians or vigilante groups accountable. Even India's elections are no longer free and fair. The courts are largely corrupt. Vigilante violence holds social discontent in check. If we look to abroad, we also face challenges in holding India accountable. American politicians want to access Indian goods and wealth through trade and through weapons sales. America does sell weapons to India. Accordingly, we hear a lot of American rhetoric right now about shared values between America and India. That's propaganda, but it has power. Up in Canada, Canada is doing marginally better in trying to hold India accountable. Right now, they are pursuing charges against key members of the BJP in the Indian state for assassinating a Canadian national on Canadian soil. But so far, that is resulting in the collapse of Canada-India relations. It's not clear that it will result in more. And so the lack of accountability, both within and without, inside India and outside of it, this is one major roadblock on the path forward towards a better India that protects rather than harms its citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Truschke, for that very informative and abbreviated presentation. I would highly recommend that folks who want to read more about her research, which is extremely important for various reasons, but one of which is that it's so timely. I would highly recommend that you purchase the book, Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism. And her chapter is called, in our Asia portion, Displacing and Disciplining Muslims in India's Burgeoning Hindu Rashtra. Next, I have the distinct pleasure of bringing on Professor Kalmar to the virtual stage. Thank you so much for being here and for talking about Muslims or Islamophobia in Eastern Europe. And the name of your chapter is very kind of counterintuitive, which is Islamophobia without Muslims, not only in Eastern Europe. Welcome, Professor Kalmar.
Thank you very much, Sahar, for inviting me here and also for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the book that includes so many fascinating contributions by so many leading scholars in this area. What I'd like to do today is inspired by my chapter and covers many things in the chapter. It's not identical with what's in the chapter, and I hope that all our listeners will read the book and put it in a wider context. So I've changed the title of the presentation a little bit. You'll see in a minute why. And the subtitle is Eastern Europe as Alabama. Islamophobia without Muslims is a phrase that people may have heard, and it's been used by both scholars and the general public kind of in an amused manner to refer to the perception that Islamophobia is particularly strong in Eastern Europe. But I think it's true and not true at the same time. And I think we have to look at it as less than amusing, and we have to look at it in a global context, not isolated to Eastern Europe. And so that's where Alabama comes in, but more specifically from this well-known quote attributed to James Carville. And it's been in the news lately when we think about Pennsylvania as a swing state in the forthcoming American election. And here, Alabama stands for an area with conservative right-wing views, and there's an implication in it of racism, including Islamophobia, backwardness, and all sorts of unappealing things that are also part of the image of Eastern Europeans. So that's where I'm making this connection. There are many connections that could be made there, not because Eastern Europe is in between two areas comparable to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And in fact, Eastern Europe is a very vague concept. Many different areas can be included there, but generally it refers to the post-communist areas of Europe. And I focus in my work, including in my article, on the so-called Visegrad 4 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And those familiar with the map of Europe can see here that these are countries at the eastern border of the European Union. The European Union is marked in light blue, and to the east of this area is Ukraine and Belarus. So what kind of explanations are offered both in the literature and in the press and sort of anecdotally at the popular level about this notion that Islamophobia is greater in Eastern Europe, even though there are fewer Muslims there? So one of the very common ways of explaining this is the so-called contact hypothesis. And according to the contact hypothesis, the more familiar you become with another group, the less likely you are to misunderstand, oppose, and hate them. But I don't think it's a very convincing hypothesis myself. I don't think that we can establish generally a correlation between familiarity and acceptance. And in some of the most striking, well-known, and most shocking cases, it doesn't work. Okay, because anti-Black racism in the US, anti-Semitism in Europe, or Islamophobia, as we have just seen in India, do not function in areas that we could refer to as without Muslims, or where the other is rare, quite on the contrary. So I'm not a believer in the contact hypothesis, although many of my colleagues are. Another explanation is that there's a deep historical difference between the West and Eastern Europe. Again, this is something I'm not a fan of. So contrary to that suggestion, I would point out that, in fact, the image of Islam, which historically in Eastern Europe is the Turks or Ottomans, is not really in any appreciable way that I can think of radically different from the image of Islam in the West. Another difference that's often pointed to is that democracy has shallow roots in Eastern Europe, and that's why Islamophobia, which is not a democratic approach, is so common there. But I think claims about how shallow democracy in Eastern Europe is compared to the West are not very convincing when you look before 1945. Some of the areas in the East have a good history of democracy, and some in the West, like Germany or Italy, we can talk about how democratic they were compared to Eastern Europe before 1945. And thirdly, this idea that there's a deep historical difference between East and West would also have to apply to Eastern Germany, the former East of Germany, where demonstrably Islamophobia is high. And right now, as we know, the AfD, an openly Islamophobic party, has won the elections in Thuringia, one of the states of Germany. But I don't think people would want to claim that East and West Germany have different cultures and different histories, when in fact the East of Germany is the location of very much that's central to German history and culture. So there's maybe a slightly more convincing hypothesis explanation there, which has to do with what happened since the Cold War. And I call this idea arrested development. And according to this, Eastern Europe missed out on the progress in liberal thought and tolerance in the West after World War II. But again, I think there are problems with this explanation, even though there may be some truth to it, because there's Islamophobia and illiberalism in peripheral regions of Western Europe and North America also. And they were part of this so-called progress. So then the question really becomes, like, is it really true that there are fewer Muslims in the East, first of all, and that there's more Islamophobia? So first, fewer Muslims. And in fact, it is true that there are fewer Muslims percentage-wise in the Visegrad 4, or let's say Eastern Europe, than in most Western countries. But once we look at regions within Western countries, then we see that there are many of them where there aren't any more Muslims percentage-wise, or not appreciably more, than in Eastern Europe. So here you see Poland 0.1%, Czech Republic 0.2%. I think this underestimates the number of Muslims there today. But then when we look at Cornwall in the UK, it has the same estimated number of Muslims as the Czech Republic. And to stay with Alabama, it's recently, this year, been estimated that the Muslim population in Alabama is about 0.5%. On your right, if you look at the map of France, you will see that a lot of France has less than 1% Muslims. And it so happens that those also are generally areas where people tend to vote for right-wing nationalist Islamophobic parties. So is there more Islamophobia in the East of Europe? And it's a little hard to come by very recent data, because Islamophobia there became a news item during the 2015-2016 so-called European migration crisis, and since then hasn't been talked about quite as much. But if you look at a Pew Research Center study from 2016, and you look at the list on your right, then you will see that indeed Eastern European countries, the Visegrad 4, have more negative views about Muslims. But if you compare Hungary with Greece, it doesn't seem to be significant. And probably it's also not significant when you compare Hungary with Italy. So the East of Europe is more Islamophobic, but not that much more than the West of Europe. And if we bring back Alabama, I have not found recent data. To be honest, I only thought of using Alabama here a few days ago, but I intend to do more research on Islamophobia in Alabama. But I did find a news item from 2002 when perhaps Islamophobia was higher than it is now, but it was shockingly high, according to a University of South Alabama poll. And it was actually more than 80% of people who didn't have a favorable view of Islam. So it was worse than Slovakia, and it was much worse than Hungary. Okay, so the question is really not, in my opinion, why Eastern Europeans are against Muslims, even though they have few of them specifically. But the question that needs to be answered is, what do Eastern Europeans have in common with groups within the West where Islamophobia is also common? So in other words, what does Eastern Europe have in common with Alabama or parts of Southern Europe? And I list here a few points that would answer that question. Both have fewer Muslims, both are peripheral areas, and both have populations with what I like to call precarious partial privilege. And I would like here to plug my book, White But Not Quite, that was generously mentioned by Sahar, where I developed this idea of precarious partial privilege as a motivator of illiberalism or populism, specifically in Central Europe. So precarious privilege, what is it? Partial privilege. It's the situation of people who are members of a privileged group, but are precariously so. So they're not really at the bottom of the hierarchy, but fear being there. It's an intersectional phenomenon, so it has several dimensions. Along the regional dimension, we're talking about a periphery, but which is within the core of the capitalist world system. So Eastern Europe, as I talk about it, the Visegrad Four, are part of the European Union, and Alabama is, of course, part of the United States, but a peripheral part. So often these are referred to as semi-periphery. I like the expression semi-core. So there's a racial dimension, and here I would refer to a phrase from my own book, White But Not Quite, or famously Off-White by Charles Mills, or talking about Eastern Europeans, Dirty White by Josef Börötz. There's a gender dimension where we talk about the white male without a college education, quote unquote. These are populations with precarious partial privilege. And last but certainly not least is a class dimension. And there's literature about the so-called Polish plumber in Eastern Europe. And there's the popular notion of white trash, which is an insulting racist expression by any means that is common in the USA. So are demeaning stereotypes about all of these groups with precarious partial privilege. And my suggestion is that although without a doubt, such groups disproportionately support illiberalism and racism may be found among them, including Islamophobia, but the difference between them and others is really not great enough to point to it as being of kind rather than degree. So what we're doing here is perhaps we're subcontracting white liberal guilt about their own racism to the periphery. And then the people that are said to be particularly racist, like hillbillies or Eastern Europeans, are subjected to what Walter Mignolo has called intramural racism. And the reaction is a populist, illiberal reaction. So I see populism as a demand for restoring privilege by groups with precarious privilege. And it's based on a class alliance between elements of capital and elements of labor, both of whom wish to use the state to protect them against competition by outsiders. So it's an ethno-national class alliance that wishes to other outsiders. I have a graph here that sums up the intersectional dimensions of precarious privilege. And as we see on the right, it results in this class alliance that I have just mentioned. Now, how does this lead to Islamophobia? And it is because the partial privilege I'm speaking of is precarious, that those who resort to Islamophobia and other forms of racism, which is not the majority of the populations I'm talking about, demand to be included among the fully privileged and to be differentiated from those who are actually outside the core of the world system, specifically the global south, or people who come from there. And so it's a strategy in racial terms to be fully white. It generates racism, including Muslims. So is this something without Muslims? Does it have nothing to do with real Muslims? And I think it is true that to a large extent, Islamophobia without Muslims is abstract and symbolic and used for political purposes. There are, of course, Muslims living in Eastern Europe or in Alabama, for that matter, and there have been reports of discrimination and violence, but perhaps given the small numbers, they don't really compare with what we see elsewhere. So in Eastern Europe, Islamophobia picked up significantly and demonstrably during the 2015 to 16 European migration crisis, when the European Union asked Eastern European governments to accept a certain number of refugees, migrants who were mostly Muslim. And Eastern European governments were in a situation that I describe in the book, where they were eager to confront Brussels or the EU. And so this increased their willingness to use Islamophobia. And the political agenda was not really directed at Muslims as much as at the EU. But also, and I think this is significant, the small number of Muslims in Eastern Europe means that it's not a political consideration in democratic elections. And this is also the case in specific localities within the West. It should be noted, though, that Eastern Europe is not isolated from the rest of the EU. And when people there speak about an invasion, quote unquote, by Muslim migrants to Western cities, they are talking about an area to which they belong, the EU. So they are not as, where they visit, they're not as isolated from it as people might think, but also where many Eastern Europeans are migrants. And so there have been competition, friction between Eastern European and non-European Muslim migrants in the UK and in the European Union. So let me conclude my talk now with some points that we may develop in the discussion and which are some of them developed in my chapter. So a precariously privileged white periphery is the social intersectional support for populism or illiberalism, in my opinion. And they present themselves as defending their traditions, read privileges, and they other Muslims as undesirable intruders, to their area, conceived more broadly, not specifically where they are, but larger areas like Europe or America. And because the white periphery generally doesn't include that many Muslims, the Muslim communities are unable to provide political pushback. This situation includes, but is not limited to, Eastern Europe. And because of that, Islamophobia without Muslims is not an amusing localized anecdote about Eastern Europeans, but it's an issue that deserves being investigated in the more global context of Islamophobia studies, and may also have something to do with Alabama. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kalmar. That was very informative as well. And admittedly, part of the world that many people don't think about when they think about the rise of Islamophobia globally. So for that reason, I highly encourage everybody purchase this book, Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, published by Oxford University Press and co-edited by myself and John Esposito. And we're so grateful to have Professor Kalmar and Professor Truschke as some of the contributors, and we have many other stellar contributors. I wanted to ask a question that really ties in what you've written with the theme of the book, which is this rise of populism globally. And Professor Kalmar, you're in Canada, Truschke, you're here in the US. We are seeing the rise of populism. And I think, to be more specific, the rise of right-wing populism. At least that's what I'm observing. How can we reconcile, or how can we explain the connections? How are they similar or different? This rise in populism in our respective countries and the rise in populism in, for example, India, with Professor Truschke's research, and in the Eastern European, at least these 4 Eastern European countries with Professor Kalmar. So Professor Truschke, do you want to start us out?
Sure. And I know, Professor Kalmar, you're in Canada, so apologies. I'm going to be real American on this. So because I think a lot about the parallels between what's happened in India and what is happening and may stand to accelerate, depending on, next couple of weeks in America in terms of right-wing populism. And I think what we have seen with Modi and the BJP in India is a fairly early case worldwide of both this kind of hard right turn, as well as what they've been able to corrupt and sort of get away with and disregard about Indian democracy. I think there are multiple lessons for America in this. The most general one is simply that democratic institutions and checks on the rise of populist leaders will not save you forever, right? They will save you from the worst of it for a little while. It'll slow it down. Like, it takes time to undo decades of, in the case of America, centuries of, civil groups and checks and balances. But at the end of the day, that can all be dismantled. And we've seen in India some really specific examples that then have actually been followed in the US. One example would be how Modi has dealt with the courts by appointing people that are sympathetic to his view, and some of which have personal loyalties to him above all else, or at least loyalties to the BJP. In Trump's first term, as of now, only term, we saw something similar, right? He appointed more people to the bench than any president in at least my memory. And that has changed the tenor of American sort of legal discourse moving forward. And we've seen it most prominently with the Supreme Court, but there have actually been effects throughout the U.S. judicial system. So I think, that's one lesson, is just like looking at how the institutions have been dismantled. Just one more brief example I'll give, and I will be brief here. You could still hold elections and not be a free democracy. Right? Being a free democracy is more than just going and voting. And so if there are folks in the audience that aren't paying attention to what Republicans are saying in the US right now about how they're going to count and not count votes, and how we're going to stop counting, and how we're replacing election officials and stuff, start listening, because they're real serious about that. And that's how you get to a point where you potentially have elections in a non-democracy.
Thank you. Professor Kalmar?
Right. And this dismantling of checks and balances has progressed in a sort of model way, almost, in Hungary in particular. And we know that Donald Trump has quoted several times, just very recently, referred to his connections to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And in many ways, he appears to me to be planning to do the same sort of thing that Audrey already referred to, in kind of personally subverting the rule of law and abstract institutions. I'd like to raise another issue, which is that the rise in populism and right-wing nationalism can still, I say still, be correlated with white sort of I don't know if I really want to say white supremacism, but white precarious privilege, and excludes in rhetoric racialized groups, including Muslims, for the purpose of increasing the identification among the majority group, which then would be represented by the populist or illiberal leaders. But in this respect, there's a difference between Eastern Europe and perhaps Alabama too, and those places where there are more Muslims, because when you have more Muslims, then they potentially will push back. So that's why, let's say in Wisconsin, where there's a large Arab population, the leaders, even Trump, have to be more careful. So it's conceivable that if there is considerable pushback from Muslim communities, that the language of right-wing populism might change and tone down the Islamophobia, possibly find another kind of enemy. What I'm saying here doesn't appear on the face of it to work so well with India, where there are many, many Muslims, but I think it would be reflected in that campaign that we heard about to take citizenship away from Muslims and thereby to decrease their power to oppose Islamophobia.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.